Okay, well, good morning, everyone. We're going to try to kind of walk our way through Leviticus 8 through 10 this morning, which is another kind of interesting scene in the Leviticus narrative. So we're taking a look now at the ordination of Aaron and his sons to the priesthood. And a couple words about some connections here to the book of Exodus. So first of all, and you may not remember this, but back in Exodus 29, we actually are given, God gives to Moses the ordination liturgy for Aaron and his sons to consecrate them to the priesthood. In Leviticus 8, that liturgy is now enacted. So it's described in Exodus 29, then enacted in Leviticus chapter 8. Now, we just want to note here that we've actually already seen a mention of priesthood already, and that once again is back in the book of Exodus. So here's what God tells Moses to tell the people of Israel as they arrive at Mount Sinai in Exodus 19, verse 3 through following. This is what God tells Moses. He says, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my commandment, you shall be my treasured possession among all the nations. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Now, a number of things is going on here with the ordination of Aaron and his sons to the priesthood, and we don't actually have time to talk about all of them, so I just want to dwell on one or two. The first thing that's certainly going on here is that what's happening to Aaron and his sons isn't actually just about them, and we'll see this in just a minute. But rather, there's something about what's going to happen to Aaron and his sons that's going to sort of remind the people of Israel about their identity and mission. Okay, so we want to keep that in mind. And the second thing that's happening here with Aaron and his sons is that they're going to literally be serving in the presence of God in the tabernacle. And therefore, what's going to happen to them is they are going to have to be consecrated or set apart for the service of God. So what we're going to see here is this ordination liturgy isn't just sort of somebody getting up and saying a bunch of words, but rather it actually changes their status before God. Okay? It allows them to enter into the tabernacle and into the presence of God. So we'll try and kind of see how these two things fit together. So I'm going to read to you a large section of 8 just because I want you to kind of get a sense of what's going on here. So here's what happens. Leviticus 8:1. Once again, obviously, this is God now instructing Moses in terms of what needs to happen. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take Aaron and his sons with him, and the garments, and the anointing oil, and the bull of the sin offering, and the 2 rams, and the basket of unleavened bread, and assemble all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting." So notice thing number 1, right? Aaron and his sons are about to be ordained to the priesthood. They've got vestments. They'll be consecrated with oil and some other things. But did you notice the mention that the whole congregation of Israel is to gather at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they're going to witness this taking place? Okay? And the reason why is, as I've just tried to say, there's something about what Aaron and his sons are going to be doing that's to remind the people of Israel of their own identity. And the other thing that's going on here is that while Aaron and his sons are in the tent, right, they will literally be representing Israel before God. So this is a public act, and everyone's going to stand there at the entrance of the tent of meeting and watch this taking place. The analogy here is if you've ever been to an ordination here, right? Once again, that's a public act as well, right? We're setting aside people to serve the church as deacons or priests, or on August the 27th, a bishop. Okay, so these are all public acts in which everyone watches what's taking place because it affects them as well. And Moses did as the Lord commanded him, And the congregation was assembled at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Moses said to the congregation, "This is the thing that the Lord has commanded to be done." And Moses brought Aaron and his sons and washed them with water. And he put the coat on him and tied the sash around his waist and clothed him with the robe and put an ephod on him and tied the skillfully woven band of the ephod around him, binding it to him with the band. And he placed the breastpiece on him, and on the breastpiece he put the Urim and the Thummim, and he set the turban on his head, and the turban in front he set the golden plate, the holy crown, as the Lord commanded him. So here's the first thing that happens. We've got Aaron, who's the high priest, right? Moses' brother. And the first act is Aaron is washed with water for the simple reason, right? He's going to be standing in the presence of God. So the water here is a symbol of purification. And then he's to put on these vestments that God's designed. God's actually a vestment designer too. He's also an architect because he designed the tabernacle. But anyway, so Aaron is supposed to put on these special clothing that he's going to wear when he goes into the presence of God. And then this. Then Moses took the anointing oil and anointed the tabernacle and all that was in it and consecrated them. So notice what's going on here, right? This word is like really, really important, to consecrate here. It means to set something apart for the use of God. Okay, when you consecrate something, what you're doing is you are setting it aside. It's now no longer just sort of like for everyday use. It has a special purpose. Now it's consecrated to God. And this can take place with either things or people. Okay, so we're going to see Aaron and his sons, they're going to be consecrated, but also the tent of meeting is going to be consecrated, and everything in it is going to be consecrated too, because it's being set aside for the use of God. And he sprinkled some of it on the altar 7 times, and anointed the altar and all its utensils, and the basin and the stand to consecrate them. And he poured out some of the anointing oil on Aaron's head, and anointed him to consecrate him. And Moses brought Aaron's sons and clothed them with the coats and tied sashes around their waists and bound caps to them as the Lord had commanded Moses. So once again, right, all these are God's instructions in terms of doing these things. Just a little footnote here. I think it's kind of helpful to think about how Leviticus ties in to the church on a kind of regular basis. It's not just kind of like an old book. But you may recognize here the outline of the Liturgy of Baptism, right? Notice the two actions that we've seen. Washing with water, and then anointing with oil. That is, in the mind of the early church, the act of baptism actually, in effect, replicated the act of Aaron and his sons being ordained to the priesthood. There's a theological message there that we don't have time to go into, but I just want to note the connection here between those two things. Then he brought the bull of the sin offering, and Aaron and his sons laid their hands on the head of the bull of the sin offering, and he killed it, and Moses took the blood with its finger and put it on the horns of the altar around it, and purified the altar, and poured out the blood at the base of the altar, and consecrated it to make atonement for it. So once again, notice the idea here is that everything that's about to be used by God is assumed, including Aaron and his sons, to be sort of like tainted with sin. And now atonement has to be made for everything. It has to be cleansed and purified, because once again, it's going to be used in the worship of God. And so it can't just be like any old thing. We'll see a dramatic story about that in just a minute. And he took all the fat that was on the entrails and the long lobe of the liver and the 2 kidneys with their fat, and Moses burned them on the altar. But the bull with its skin and its flesh and its dung he burned up in a fire outside the camp, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Then he presented the ram of the burnt offering and for Aaron and his sons, and laid hands on the head of the ram, and he killed it, and Moses threw the blood against the sides of the altar. And the description goes on. So you get the picture here, right? So what has to happen now is that the whole series of sacrifices that are offered, one series of sacrifices purifies everything in the tabernacle. Another series of sacrifices purifies Aaron and his sons. So all this can now be used in the service of God. And in 822, we get a sacrifice that's called the Ram of Ordination. That's to purify Aaron and his sons, because obviously they're impure too, so they need to be purified so they can come into the tabernacle. And then this, and I've suggested that we incorporate this into modern ordination liturgies. So here's what happens. As they take some of the blood of the Ram of Ordination, and then Moses takes some of the blood and puts it on the right ear and the right thumb and the big toe of Aaron and his sons. That's part of their ordination. This is part of their cleansing. So now they're kind of ready now to serve, and then it sort of all this ordination liturgy kind of concludes like this. So they take the anointing oil, the blood from the atonement sacrifices. It's all put on Aaron and his sons, all the equipment in the tabernacle itself, and then the final thing that's consecrated are the vestments that Aaron and his sons are going to wear. Those things are consecrated as well. And then here's how it ends, and I think this is really interesting. This is one of these places, right, that you're reading along and you may be getting a little bored with all the blood and the guts and stuff like that, and just kind of lose track. But this is really important. It's really significant. It's a significant clue about what's going on here. And you shall not go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting for 7 days until the days of your ordination are completed, for it will take 7 days to ordain you. As has been done today, the Lord has commanded to be done to make atonement for you. At the entrance of the tent of meeting you shall remain day and night for 7 days, performing what the Lord has charged, so that you do not die, for I have been commanded. And Aaron and his sons did all the things that the Lord had commanded by Moses. So notice what happens here. The ordination liturgy for consecrating Aaron and his sons and also for consecrating the tabernacle takes 7 days. And of course, we've seen this before, right? In Genesis 1, with the 7 days of creation. And there's an important connection. We're being told here that in a way that we don't quite understand yet, we'll understand more of this later on, in a way that we don't quite understand yet, God is going to use this space, the tabernacle, and these folks, the priests, they're going to be part of God's plan literally to re-sanctify creation. Okay? One little hint of this, and I'll just put this in as a footnote, and we'll take a look at it later when we get to it, but in 1 Kings, when Solomon builds the temple, the permanent place for the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem, we're given a description of what the temple looks like on the inside. And we don't need to go into detail here except to say this, that the decor on the inside of the temple replicates a garden. There are all these kind of plants and flowering things and trees and whatnot, and the idea seems to be this, that the temple, or the tabernacle, is the one place in all of creation that has been restored to the purity of the Garden of Eden. And that's because God dwells there. But the important thing to notice, right, is that, and this is one of the reasons why the temple is so important, the temple in effect is a visible promise, right? Right now, this part of creation has been re-sanctified, but it's a promise that eventually, right, the whole of creation will be re-sanctified. Okay, so it's a sort of sign of things to come. So that's the consecration of the tabernacle and Aaron and his sons. And now in chapter 9, something really important happens, and that is all the sacrifices that we've just been reading about in 1 through 7 are now all offered all at once. Okay, so it's a kind of a blowout sacrificial day. All the sacrifices are offered, but I want to draw your attention to two little, they're like small points, but they're also very important. The first is Leviticus 9:1. On the 8th day, Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel and said to Aaron, "Take for yourselves a bull calf for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering, both without blemish, and offer them before the Lord. And you shall say to the people of Israel, take a male goat for a sin offering, and a calf and a lamb and a year-old without blemish for a burnt offering, and an ox for peace offerings, and sacrifice before the Lord, and a grain offering mixed with oil. Today the Lord will appear to you." So here's what's going to happen. All the offerings that we've just been reading about in 1 through 7 are now all going to be offered together by the priests that have just been ordained in the tabernacle that's just been consecrated. And Moses is told to tell the people, okay, something really important is going to happen at the end of all this, and that is that the Lord himself is going to appear to you. Okay, and that's actually, in fact, what happens. Now, just want to note here, Leviticus 1:9, on the 8th day. So 7 days of creation, right? 7 days to kind of reconsecrate creation, and then we get the 8th day. What we'll find, not within the New Testament, but later on in the early church, is we'll find that the day of resurrection is referred to as the 8th day of creation, right? 7 days, the world was created, sin intervened. On the 8th day, the day of resurrection, creation was restored. So the 8th day here becomes a really important idea. And I actually think it carries this message here. That is, the message that we're getting here on the 8th day is that God and Israel will be completely restored as a result of everything that's just about to happen. Okay? Now we'll see that restoration, unfortunately, doesn't last very long. As a matter of fact, it seems to last for about half an hour before we have kind of like another almost like golden calf incident. But we'll take a look at that in just a minute. So what happens is in 9, all the sacrifices that we've just read about in Leviticus 1 through 7 are all offered. And at the end of this, here's what happens. This is Leviticus 9:22 and following. So all the cereal offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering, the burnt offering, these have all been offered now. And then we have this. Then Aaron lifted up his hands toward the people and blessed them. And he came down from offering the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offering. So notice what happens here. Okay, all the offerings have been offered. Aaron comes out of the tabernacle where all the people are assembled, and he blesses them in the name of God. Okay, obviously, right, this should return our minds back to Genesis 1, right? Well, remember what God says when he has created human people, when he's created people, right? God blesses them and says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, right? Now we've got God and Israel restored. Aaron comes out of the tabernacle and he blesses the people of Israel in God's name. It's not just Aaron like saying a bunch of nice words. Rather, it is Aaron communicating the blessing of God himself to the assembled people of Israel at the tabernacle. And then, and this is kind of like the finale, if you want to think about it this way. And Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting, and when they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people, and the fire came down before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the pieces of fat on the altar. When all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. Okay, so after all these offerings have been made, the glory of the Lord appears to all the people of Israel. And this word glory, I think, is a really interesting word. It's kind of one of these kind of lovely Hebrew words that has kind of like a whole bunch of meanings. If you look up the word here in a Hebrew lexicon, the thing about it, goes on for a couple pages listing all its potential meanings. And I think the thing about it, right, is, you don't want to say, okay, which one of these is just like its real meaning? Well, no, it means all these things. But one of the things that it means here, the idea of glory is it means in a really real sense, it's the weight of the divine presence. This word kavod literally means weight. It's the weightiness of God's presence who is actually really among his people and is allowing them to see his presence among. So this is not just, okay, we're going to go through this interesting little liturgy and we'll all pretend that it's somehow important. No. We're going to offer these sacrifices, and when it's all done, we will be in the presence of God. And that's the way Leviticus 9 ends. Now, of course, it would be really nice, right, if at the beginning of Leviticus 10, right, it simply said, and they all lived happily ever after as an obedient and lovely people. But of course, that's not what's going to happen, right? So let's take a look at Leviticus 10. Leviticus 10 is the unfortunate story of two of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu. And of course, one of the things we learn, right, all the way through the Old Testament is, unfortunately, that some of the worst characters in the Old Testament are priests. Just kind of file that away for future memory. So I'll read you the story here. So tabernacle built, consecrated, Aaron and his sons consecrated, sacrifices offered, the glory of the Lord appears, Israel and God are completely reconciled, and now we're ready to go off for like a glorious future of the people of God, except for Leviticus 10:1. Now Nadab and Abihu and the sons of Aaron each took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. Okay? Now this is not just like a little liturgical mistake like wearing the wrong color, wearing green instead of red on Pentecost or something like that. This is like far more serious. And here's what happens. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them. And they died before the Lord. And Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord said. Among those who were near me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people I will be glorified." And Aaron held his peace. So notice what Moses says to his brother Aaron, who's obviously sad, right, that two of his sons basically were just incinerated by God. Moses says, look, God's made it clear that anyone in his service is there to glorify him, not simply do what they want. This is what God's done, and you, brother, have to accept it. And then later on, what happens is that Aaron is actually told not to mourn his two sons being incinerated by God, because they acted in a way that did not glorify God. Okay? So this is an interesting story for a couple reasons, right? I think that one of the most significant things about it is it tells us something really important. It tells us something about the nature of worship, right? It tells us that the purpose of worship here is to glorify God and to bring his people into communion with him. It's not to be like creative or, hey, it would really be neat if we did fill in the blank. Okay, so apparently what they do here, what Nadab and Abihu have done here is they've got, a censer. So this, the church's use of incense obviously goes all the way back to the Old Testament. What they've done is they've taken their censer, their thurible, that kind of, brass thing that you see at the 11:15 service, and they've kind of put some sort of incense on it to use, but it's not an incense they were authorized to use. They thought that, hey, this is really lovely incense. Got it from a perfectly reputable, firm. It's my favorite smell. Let's go ahead and use it. Unfortunately, it was unauthorized, and so, as I said, the fire comes out from before God, and Nadab and Abihu are simply incinerated. Later on, we get instructions about their their incinerated bodies being carried out of the tabernacle and taken outside the camp. But I think it's really important to notice this, right? What Moses says is really significant. Among those who are near me, I will be sanctified, right? Those who are consecrated to my service will be sanctified, and what they will do will be aimed at my glory, not just doing stuff. And there's obviously a penalty for just doing stuff. Now later on, it's interesting to see how this scene kind of comes to an end, and this is probably where we'll need to stop. The sons of Aaron are given some really important instructions, and we'll see how this unfolds beginning in chapter 11 next week in terms of what Aaron and his sons are supposed to do. But at the end, in Leviticus 10:8 or 10:9, we get kind of like a mission statement for Aaron and his sons, which I think is important to note. So here's what they're told. Drink no wine or strong drink, you or your sons, when you go into the tent of meeting, lest you die. Okay, instruction number 1. Don't come into the tent of meeting having had a couple of glasses of wine beforehand. Because if you do, you'll be struck dead. Once again, right, that's dishonoring God, right? You waltz into God's presence, maybe a little tipsy, something like that. Don't do it. It shall be for you a statute forever about your generations. And then this. You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean. And you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. So here we have the essential job description of Aaron and his sons, right? On one hand, they're to serve in the tabernacle, offering Israel sacrifices, so that's part of their job. But they have 2 other really important jobs, and I want to say a word about all of them together. They're also to distinguish between holy and unholy, or clean and unclean. As I say, we'll be reading a lot about that starting in chapter 11. We'll get distinctions about what all that involves. And then also, their job is to teach all of God's statutes, which have been revealed to Moses, to the people of Israel. So I think one way of thinking about what Aaron and his sons are supposed to do is this: that they have a really important function in the life of the people of Israel. And this is why I think Nadab and Abihu are struck dead. Aaron and his sons have been given the really important job or vocation of aiding in the process of sanctifying God's people, of enabling them to be holy, right? And that takes place in a couple ways. Thing number 1, right? Sacrifice, right? As we saw in chapters 1 through 7, right? All the sacrifices are aimed at getting the people to offer themselves to God. So what's going on in that tabernacle is really important. So that's a form of sanctification. A second form of sanctification is to sort of make a distinction between the holy and the unholy, the pure and the impure. That obviously is important too, right? That'll have some important moral implications, as we'll see later on. And then finally, to teach God's statutes to the people so that, right, they can fulfill that priesthood that we just read about in Exodus 19. That is, the idea is this: look, if the people of Israel are simply like everyone else, what good are they? Right? This is sort of like the Old Testament version of the Sermon on the Mount, right? You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. But if the salt has lost its saltiness, what good is it? Right? You're the light of the world, but who lights a lamp and then puts it in the closet? Right? No, you want the lamp to illuminate everything around you, right? You want the salt to transform everything around it. So the people of Israel are just like all the other people in the world, right? They're no use to God. And so Aaron and his sons are going to play an important role. in helping the people of Israel stand apart from everyone else and be salt and light, and therefore be part of God's larger plan to redeem humankind. And that's why their role is taken so seriously, right? It's almost like God saying, look, if you're not going to take the sanctification of my people seriously, I'm going to deal with you. Right? I'm not playing around, folks, right? That's what God's saying to Nadab and Abihu and to all those who come after him. And that's why I think the way this ends is so significant. Now, all this ends up in I think a really important way, and that is all this ends up with Aaron, the high priest, going into the tabernacle and going into the most holy place and standing in front of the Ark of the Covenant, which is the earthly representation of God's throne, where he literally represents the people of Israel in his own person. One way to think about this is you may remember from the description of some of the vestments that Aaron's supposed to wear, one of the things that he wears is this interesting breast piece. It's kind of like a piece of thick cloth that kind of goes over his head and then hangs over his chest. And on that piece of cloth, there are 12 gems inset in it. Each gem bears one of the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. So as Aaron is standing before the Ark of the Covenant, he literally represents the people of Israel before God. Another kind of important clue as to his role, but also what's going on here is, remember, Aaron also has that turban that kind of fits on his head. If you want to kind of translate this into Anglican terminology, think of it as a mitre, like a bishop wears, right? There's a brass plate that's inset on the forehead part of that turban, and it simply says this: "Holy to the Lord." That is, it's a reminder, right, that Aaron himself has been consecrated to the service of God, but he represents a people who have been consecrated to the service of God, right? The people of Israel, for all their problems, for all their disobedience, for all their recalcitrance, nevertheless, as this little plaque reminds us, right, are holy to the Lord. They've been consecrated to the service of God. And that describes their mission, right? They've been called together for a purpose. So what we'll do next Sunday is we'll pick things up with Leviticus 11, and we'll try to walk through this distinction between clean and unclean. It's a little difficult because it kind of deals with some things that they're kind of like remote from our own experience. But what we'll try and do is we'll try and see what's going on with this really important distinction and some of the implications of kind of thinking in those terms. And I'll try and connect this with some things that Jesus says about purity in the Gospel of Matthew.